Hello again. I am Megan, and I'm going to be talking about Melanie Metzger's Deconstructing the Myth of Neutrality. This is going to be my sixth blog. And so today, our big question that we're responding to is, does the finding that most non-renditions were directed at deaf participants show that interpreters are partial in their provision of services? What kind of influence does this have on the interaction and the participants' perceptions of interpreted encounters? So today I'm going to be using, I'm going to be talking about sort of like code choices and footing, and from the previous blog that included this big question. And one of the findings from the research that Ms. Metzger did was that, and to remind you, non-renditions are instances where the interpreter was the author and animator of an utterance. So that means that what they said or what they signed did not come from the deaf participant or the hearing participant or any of the other active participants, but from the interpreter themselves. Um, so So in the research, she found that most of the non-renditions, and there weren't a ton, but there were several. Most of the non-renditions in the studied encounters were directed at deaf participants, but usually were to allow 100% access. So basically, that means if there was some confusion or something got lost in the discourse, the interpreter would try to save that and or if there was maybe some confusion about what was being said, the interpreter would try to save that part of the encounter and make sure that each person got everything they needed out of that encounter. So they basically saved the discourse by saying something that was not necessarily from either from any of the primary sources. So today I came up with three sort of rules to live by for interpreting encounters based on some of their biblical, some of the readings in the biblical heritage class, and I'm mainly going to be working out of the PMBC's article on gay marriage. And I'm really going to be talking about how they use the Bible in that article. They basically say that even if you can't agree with the argument about gay marriage that they kind of concocted, I don't even know that I agree with it, but it's sort of basically says that the references to homosexual behavior in the Bible are about adulterous homosexual behavior, not homosexuality. And so the way that they use the Bible in that way, I will be, in the response to homosexuality as far as in the church, is how I'll be using the Bible. So they basically say that even if you can't agree with the argument, acting out of love means that we need to be completely inclusive, and that doesn't mean we have to motivate sinful behavior or even be a part of it or include ourselves in that, but be sort of meek in the face of sin. So to make the church completely accessible for everybody. And so in that way, I came up with three main things to stick to when I become an interpreter that will help to provide inclusiveness, no matter what the discourse is. So the first one is shy away from parentalism. So in the article, they kind of talk about how it's not a Christian's place or anybody's place to sort of judge and throw stones at a person that they think is living in habitual sin, because everyone else is living in that kind of habitual sin and on different levels, and really the Bible says that there's no sin greater than another sin. So sometimes we tend to think, oh well, that's a murderer, they're a lot worse than me, I just lie sometimes to get out of sticky situations. But in God's eyes, those things balance out and they're exactly the same. So parentalism in sign language interpreting basically means that sometimes interpreters can treat deaf people who are not, they might be behind developmentally as far as language goes, but they're not missing any pieces upstairs. There's no retardation there unless there is. There's no their mental capacities are the same as everybody else's. They just can't hear. So so sometimes interpreters misconceive that there is some kind of mental capacity missing, and so they treat deaf people in some of these interpreted encounters like they're their parents, like they have to really, make sure that they're getting all the information, that they're making the most cautious choice that they possibly could be, and to reiterate and reiterate, making sure that they know exactly what they're getting into before they do anything. And that can be, and it's called parentalism, and that can be really taxing for a deaf person to deal with, just because there are some deaf people, I assume many deaf people who are more intelligent than I am, that know a lot more about a lot more than I do, so it wouldn't be my place at all to go and try to coddle a deaf person into making the right choices and stuff, based on what I think, or how I perceive the encounter to be going. So one of the verses that I really like, that I think applies to many of these ethical situations in the class, is Matthew 25:40. And it says, "And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me." And so basically it's saying that that however you're treating the least of God's followers, or the least of anyone, any of the people that you meet, you've treated Jesus that way. You've treated the Lord that way. And so I really think about that when I'm interacting with people in my daily life, but I think that could be especially important when dealing with interpreted encounters with the deaf. I think I certainly don't want to call deaf people the least of these, but I just mean in an interpreted situation, you've got a hearing person and a deaf person. In that specific situation, the deaf person may be exorbitantly more intelligent than the hearing person, but they're missing, a sort of significant piece of that interaction, and not being able to hear, and that's so unfortunate. But and some of them don't really consider it to be unfortunate, but for our sake, we'll just say that it's, the upper hand goes to the hearing person, because they are often in control of the situation. Whether it be a doctor's office, a lawyer, a courtroom, the majority is hearing and the minority is deaf. So they're automatically kind of the underdog, and so I think treating them as well as possible is really something that that I think God would appreciate. And so I think also when we think about homosexuals, and I hate that, I really don't mean to be comparing gays and deaf people, because that's not related. But the way that we've been reading about it is kind of related, just because we sometimes think about homosexuals as these habitual sinners that can't stop, and they can't get out of the lifestyle, and they're even thinking that their lifestyle is biblical or right or something, and so they're kind of the least of us because they are purposefully living in sin. And so in that way, that deaf people kind of have no way out of being deaf. So we have to, as interpreters, kind of bring them up in some way to being more on an equal level with hearing people, especially so that they're not taken advantage of. But the point of the bullet point was that we not treat them like invalids. So my second bullet point thing that I came up with is to promote access. So basically, we as interpreters want to make it so that deaf people have as much access as everyone else, and that hearing people have as much access as everyone else. So in those situations where the deaf person has the upper hand, where they're in charge, where they're, the person with the money or whatever, we want to make sure that they're not, that the hearing person is up to speed, and that the deaf person is up to speed, and that no one's being mistreated or discriminated against because they're deaf, or that they're not being taken advantage of in that specific situation because they're deaf. It gets kind of sticky when it comes to, like, I can think of a couple situations where maybe a business person is trying to maximize on the fact that a person is deaf, or possibly a deaf person is trying to maximize on the fact that someone is hearing to get an upper hand, or to get money, or to get whatever. So those kind of situations we'll maybe talk about at the end, but for our purposes, we want to promote access between everyone. And so my final bullet point is that we want to empower the deaf person. Now, I think that this in particular can be a little bit sticky. However, I agree that we need to empower the deaf person and make sure that the deaf person has their right to speak, their right to take up space in that room, and have their voice heard, which would be your voice in that situation. So empowering the deaf person is extremely important, and I think that this kind of goes with the PMBC's article about gay marriage, because gays are so ostracized from the church. They are treated so poorly by Christians and by kind of everybody, kind of a lot of people, in the same way that blacks were treated really poorly by Christians and by everybody in the 60s and beyond. So I think that in this day and age, it's time to really get rid of those barriers and break those barriers despite our belief systems. We are all believing something different, and so I think in the article they really emphasizing the fact that there's nothing wrong with thinking what you think, but God promotes peace and love, not egging egging a gay person's marriage, or picketing outside of funerals, or denying insurance to people who are not of your same school of thought. And so I think that this is important. It's important to empower deaf people because as a minority, they may be of the same educational level as us, as hearing people, maybe of the same sort of caliber, of the same tax bracket, but since they're missing a sort of significant piece, they automatically get sort of cast downward, and that's not right. It's not fair at all. If this were the 60s, I wouldn't even be at Baylor because of the color of my skin, and because maybe I speak a little bit of Ebonics here and there. That's not right. It's wrong to treat people poorly just because they're not the same as you, and so I think that's one of the highlights of PMBC's article, is that just because they're not sinning the same way you're sinning doesn't mean that they can't be a part of the church. And in this way, just because deaf people are not experiencing life or hearing like you're hearing doesn't mean that they can't be a part of everything, and they should have complete access to everything, and their voices ought to be heard, even though their voices are not audible. So, that is my 6th blog. I hope it was enlightening. I'll see you next week with my 7th blog, and then finally the last one. Have a super weekend. Happy Thanksgiving.